He stood 5 feet 9 inches tall. He weighed, generously, 170 pounds. No claws, no fangs, no exoskeleton or natural armor, no venom glands, no bioluminescent fret displays, no secondary limbs, no reinforced skeletal structure, no biological chemical defense systems. His skin, and I observed this with the clinical detachment of someone cataloging a specimen, appeared thin enough that significant subcutaneous damage could result from moderately forceful contact. His bones, based on standard human physiological data I reviewed after his arrival, were substantially less dense than even baseline cravati bones, which we do not consider particularly impressive. He had forward-facing eyes, which I would later come to understand as deeply significant. At the time, I noted them only as slightly unusual, a predator adaptation in a creature that otherwise showed no predator characteristics whatsoever. When he walked into the training hall for the first time, Kraft laughed, not a polite acknowledgement that the situation was mildly incongruous. A full, booming, echoing laugh that bounced off the high metal walls and caused several other cadets to look up from their warm-up exercises. When they saw what he was laughing at, a few of them joined in. The laughter was not cruel. Exactly. It was a laughter of creatures who were genuinely puzzled by what they were looking at. The same laugh you might produce if someone handed you a butter knife and told you it was a weapon. I did not stop them. I was, if I am being completely honest, asking myself the same question they were laughing about. What was this soft pink creature doing in my hole? The Gauntlet is not official curriculum. I want to be clear about this, because the events that follow might suggest otherwise. The Gauntlet is pure cadet tradition, passed down through generations of violent youth who have discovered, repeatedly, that making newcomers prove themselves serves as a useful preliminary filter. If a new cadet cannot survive the social pressure, the psychological testing, the occasional physical escalation of senior cadets deciding to make their lives difficult, then they certainly cannot survive the actual training. And if they cannot survive the training, the combat they will eventually face will kill them in ways that are embarrassing for the Academy statistics. Senior cadets, those who have survived at least 2 full cycles, get to test the arrivals. The methods vary. Sometimes it is psychological warfare, persistent subtle undermining, social isolation, manufactured crises designed to reveal how a cadet performs under sustained emotional pressure. Sometimes it is physical, ambushes in corridors, aggressive sparring sessions where the senior cadet is clearly not calibrating for safety, forcing a newcomer to engage multiple opponents simultaneously. The instructors know about the Gauntlet. We observe it. We document outcomes. We officially maintain complete ignorance of its existence. It is, if you can step back from the individual discomfort it causes, genuinely useful data. Marcus Webb had been avoiding the Gauntlet for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. In my 17 cycles of the Academy, I had never seen a target avoid selection for more than 12 days. Most newcomers are approached within 3. But Marcus had done something quietly remarkable. He had made himself uninteresting to predators. He arrived early to training and left precisely on time. He sat in the middle of seating arrangements, never at an edge. He responded to provocations with such consistently measured, unremarkable reactions that escalating against him offered no visible reward. He was, as far as any predator could assess, simply not worth the effort. Smart strategy, genuine survival intelligence. But the senior cadets were circling more tightly each week. I could see it in how they tracked him during drills, eyes lingering a half-second too long, conversations that stopped when he passed, the particular predator body language of something that has selected a target and is now simply waiting for optimal conditions. They had noticed his avoidance. They had begun to interpret it as fear. And fear, to a predator, is an invitation. Marcus, for his part, appeared entirely oblivious. He went about his training with the quiet, methodical focus of someone completing a project they find moderately interesting, showed up for every session, performed adequately if not spectacularly, and disappeared afterward back to his quarters. He sat alone during most meal periods, reading. He did not seek alliances or make social overtures. He simply existed within the Academy's rhythms, unremarkable and untroubling. I had started to wonder, genuinely, whether he understood what was coming. It happened on what Torx Prime cycle schedule translates to as a Thursday, that specific point in the training week when exhaustion has accumulated past the point where most cadets are operating on spite and adrenaline alone, when reaction times are degraded and emotional regulation has frayed. prime ambush conditions. In other words, the kind of timing that indicates either instinct or calculation, and with senior cadets this experience, I had long since stopped distinguishing between the two. I was running inventory in the equipment storage hall, counting plasma rifles, a task I reserved for moments when I need the meditation of repetition, when I heard them. 6 sets of footsteps, moving with a distinctive rhythm of coordinated predator behavior. Not walking, not marching, moving. There is a difference that every creature who has ever been hunted understands on a cellular level, and even in my position of complete physical safety, my secondary eyelids flickered involuntarily. I should have stayed with my inventory. Instructor regulations are clear. The Gauntlet is cadet business. My involvement, absent genuine medical emergency, was neither required nor appropriate. Instead, I followed the sound. The corridor outside the secondary training bay was a deliberate choice of location. I understood this immediately upon seeing the configuration. It was isolated from primary traffic patterns, structurally narrow enough to limit escape vectors, and positioned far enough from monitoring stations that any incident could plausibly be described afterward as a private disagreement. Someone had done careful reconnaissance. Someone had planned this. They had Marcus cornered against the wall at the corridor's dead end. 6 of them. Let me describe them properly, because the specific composition of this group was not accidental. Whoever had organized this had assembled something close to a perfect killing team, each member covering the gaps the others left. Torv led them, a Drazian, 7 feet of muscle so dense it appeared to have been compressed under geological pressure, with ridge-like bone structures running across his skull and down his spine that served as natural battering rams. His species evolved in environments where the dominant predator strategy was simply to crush prey against hard surfaces with overwhelming force, and Tor was an exceptional specimen of his species. He sat 3rd in the Academy's combat rankings, and the only reason he was not higher was that he lacked the imagination to be dangerous in situations that did not fit his evolutionary template. In situations that did fit that template, he was essentially unstoppable. His shoulders were wider than most species were tall. During orientation, his handshake had hospitalized 3 cadets, and he had not, as far as anyone could determine, been trying. Senna stood to his left, and she made my scales itch in the particular way that truly dangerous things do. Feline, from a world of perpetual darkness where her species had evolved not just predator instinct but predator patience, the ability to stalk a target for days without revealing herself, moving in complete silence, reading environmental cues with sensory systems tuned to a pitch of sensitivity I could barely conceptualize. Her fur carried bioluminescent patterns that she could shift and alter at will, allowing her to either blend into nearly any background or project visual patterns specifically designed to disorient prey during the killing strike. Her claws were retractable and, at full extension, capable of breaching standard armor plating with sustained pull. I had watched her stalk a target for 3 full days during a survival exercise. When she finally struck, the engagement lasted 4 seconds. The target never knew she was there until the moment it was over. Greaves and Haxon were Yulthari, a bonded pair who fought as a single organism. Their species had no word for individual combat and no framework for it. They trained together, ate together, slept in proximity, and had developed over their years of partnership a synchronization so complete that they anticipated each other's actions not through communication, but through pure internalized knowledge of how the other would move. Greaves was a restraint specialist. His forearms were designed by evolution to grip and hold with a force that could immobilize most species regardless of their physical strength. Once he had something, it did not leave. Haxon was a damage specialist. Crystalline growths along his forearms had developed over his species' evolutionary history into edges sharper than fabricated blades, and his striking style used those edges in ways that were, technically, beautiful if you could separate the appreciation from the horror. Separating them in combat was a theoretical exercise only. No one had successfully managed it in practice. Vex should have made me intervene immediately. A Corvati, a species that breathed toxic gas as a biological baseline and could, without any additional effort, render the air in an enclosed space unbreathable within 90 seconds. He could not help this. His biology simply worked that way. Administration had granted him special academy clearance because his combat applications were exceptional, requiring only that he wear suppressant filters during training to prevent inadvertent casualties. He had removed his filter, standing in a narrow enclosed corridor, with a human cadet who had no chemical resistance adaptations whatsoever. I felt my hand move toward my comm unit. Regulations be damned. And then I saw Nile, hanging at the back of the group with the confident stillness of someone who knows they do not need to be in the front. Slender, almost delicate-looking by Predator standards, which, as any experienced combat instructor should know immediately, is not a comforting observation but a deeply alarming one. His species, the Zenfri, evolved as ambush hunters in dense jungle environments where size was not an advantage but a liability. They developed instead something far more insidious than claws or venom: neural disruption, psychic interference. He could not read minds with any precision, but he could sense emotional states and anticipate physical intent with accuracy that functionally amounted to limited precognition in combat situations. More usefully, or rather, more terrifyingly, he could project enough mental static into an opponent's neurological processing to create hesitation at critical moments. In a fair fight, he was formidable. In an ambush situation, with a target already physiologically stressed and neurologically primed for fear responses, he was practically unbeatable. 6 apex predators, 6 distinct evolutionary lineages, 6 different hunting methodologies that together covered almost every possible defensive response a target might attempt. The positioning was not random. They had arranged themselves to create overlapping fields of attack, to cut off escape vectors, to ensure that whatever Marcus attempted, at least 3 of them would be optimally positioned to respond. And Marcus stood in the center of it. He had not pressed himself against the wall. He was not attempting to find an escape route or create distance. He was not in a visible defensive crouch or adopting any of the threat response postures that the vast majority of species share across the galaxy, because fear is apparently a universal language with a remarkably consistent grammar. He was just standing there, training bag still slung over one shoulder, weight balanced casually on both feet, breathing slow and even, his chest rising and falling with the rhythmic patience of someone who had decided, some time ago, that being startled was no longer a useful expenditure of energy. He was watching them close and with the same expression he wore during my lectures on tactical theory: mild interest, slight boredom, even the expression of someone who has identified a situation as less complex than it initially appeared. Something cold ran along my secondary spinal ridge. This was wrong. Every prey species in the galaxy, and many predator species caught off guard, exhibits recognizable physiological fear responses when surrounded by multiple larger, armed opponents in an enclosed space. Elevated heart rate, rapid, shallow breathing, pupils dilating or contracting depending on species. Defensive posturing. Some attempt to increase perceived size. Some attempt to decrease perceived visibility. Fight, flight, or freeze. The 3 responses that evolution has written into the survival instincts of almost every mobile species we have ever catalogued. Marcus Webb was showing none of them. Toll's voice came out like gravel being processed through heavy machinery. You have been avoiding us, human. We thought perhaps you did not understand academy tradition. He let the sentence sit in the recycled air of the corridor, heavy with implication. Let us educate you. The circle tightened. Senna's claws extended just slightly, an involuntary tell that she was moving from assessment to preparation. Vex's breathing changed, deeper, slower, deliberate, pumping more of his species biology into the enclosed air. Greaves shifted his stance 3 inches to the left, opening an angle. Haxon's crystalline growths caught the corridor light. Niall's eyes went distant in a specific way that meant his attention had divided, part of it tracking his physical environment, part of it reaching into the electromagnetic space around Marcus' mind, reading his fear, mapping his hesitation, preparing to exploit the moment when one of the others struck, and Marcus' neurological processing spiked into panic. This was the moment. This was when an instructor stepped in. This was when the gauntlet got pulled back from the edge by a voice of authority, and the evening ended with everyone frustrated but physically intact. My mouth opened. Marcus smiled. I have studied facial expressions across hundreds of species as part of my professional obligations. Emotional state interpretation is a survival skill in multi-species environments. You learn to read what you can from creatures whose biology may be entirely unlike your own, because misreading a predator's emotional state has historically lethal consequences. I knew that humans smiled. I had read the physiological literature. I understood that the expression, lips retracting to display teeth, served as a social bonding signal in human culture, a display of positive emotion and non-threatening intent. Basic primate communication. Harmless. What I saw in that corridor was not harmless. It was not the social smile I had read about. It was not friendly. It was not warm. The lips were pulling back, yes, and the teeth were showing, yes, but everything else about the expression was wrong. The eyes had gone completely still, completely focused, locked onto Tor with a kind of absolute attention I usually only saw in my cadets when they were calculating kill trajectories. The muscles around his jaw had tightened in a way that suggested force barely contained. And something beneath the expression, something in the quality of the attention itself, in the utter absence of any of the social softness that normally accompanied a human smile, had converted a gesture of warmth into something that communicated only one thing, with unmistakable clarity. I know exactly what you are, and I have already decided what to do about it. The effect was instantaneous. Tov, who had sat through a fight with Zara without his ridge structures moving so much as a fraction, went still. His ridge structures, which I had never seen flatten except in species literature describing Drazion threat response physiology, pressed down against his skull, a defensive reflex. His massive hands, which had been slowly flexing in anticipation of reaching for something, went motionless at his sides. Senna's bioluminescent pattern stuttered. For a fraction of a second, her camouflage patterning went incoherent. She was using active cognitive resources to manage it, and those resources had just been redirected by something her instinct was screaming about louder than her conscious mind could manage. The Yulthari twins, Greaves and Haxon, whose partnership was so complete that I had genuinely begun to think of them as a single entity, broke synchronization. Just for a moment, just long enough for each of them to glance, independently, at a space that was not the target, an escape assessment, something that should have been impossible for them to do unconsciously. And I noticed, in that same crystallized fraction of a second, that Marcus' posture had changed. The change was subtle enough that I almost missed it, and I had spent 17 cycles training my observation skills on the finest warriors a galaxy produced. His weight had shifted forward, barely perceptibly, onto the balls of his feet. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, had curled, not into fists, but into something more flexible, more responsive. His head had tilted down by perhaps half an inch, a movement that simultaneously protected his throat and dropped his gaze to the slightly lower angle from which forward-facing predator eyes observed targets they intend to pursue. His shoulders had dropped and settled in a way that, I now recognized with a jolt of delayed understanding, was not relaxation at all. It was a combat-ready position, an extraordinarily well-disguised combat-ready position, calibrated to appear like casual ease while placing his body in optimal configuration for rapid response. He had been in that position since before they surrounded him. He had known they were coming. Problem? Marcus asked. 2 syllables. The tone was perfectly conversational. The tone you use when asking a neighbor if their atmospheric processor is running correctly, or confirming with a colleague that a meeting time is still accurate. Completely neutral. Completely unbothered. The absolute absence of any emotional content that should have been present given the situation he was standing in. That absence was what broke them. Not a threat. Not aggression. Not a counter-display of force or size or biological weaponry he did not have. Just a word, spoken in a tone that communicated, with devastating clarity, that the speaker had assessed the situation and found it significantly less concerning than the surrounding parties appeared to believe. Senna took 1 step backward. It was a small step, barely notable as physical movement, but in the psychology of pack dynamics, it was catastrophic. A senior predator, a creature whose species had survived for millennia by reading threat environments with flawless precision, had assessed the situation and determined that her position was less optimal than a different position. Her bioluminescent patterns flared bright orange, the Cloyd distress signal, deep evolutionary programming overriding conscious control. She had not decided to step back. Her biology had decided for her, and then it cascaded. Pack dynamics are elegant when they function correctly and catastrophic when they fail. The collective confidence that had made 6 individuals into a unified threat was constructed from each member's certainty that the others shared their assessment of the situation. The moment one member's assessment visibly shifted, the architecture of shared certainty began to crack along every load-bearing seam simultaneously. Vex stopped his deliberate breathing. His toxic exhalations, which should, by this point, have been creating a physiological effect in Marcus' unprotected respiratory system, had apparently produced no observable response whatsoever. The human was still breathing at the same steady rate. still watching them with the same focused attention, still smiling. Vex's biological weapon had fired and produced no result, and the part of his brain responsible for threat assessment was now quietly revising its model of what it was looking at. Greaves and Haxon separated, not by much, a foot, perhaps two, but their formation, the interlocking configuration that made them dangerous as a unified organism, had fragmented. Each of them was now, independently, angling slightly toward open corridor, preparing options they should not have needed to prepare. Now had gone pale. His species maintained a particular coloration that deepened or lightened based on autonomic physiological responses, and what I was observing was a Zen-free equivalent of blood draining from a face. He was reading Marcus Webb with abilities that had never failed him in live combat situations, abilities that had given him intelligence on opponents that bordered on the supernatural, and whatever he was reading had convinced him, on a level beneath rational processing, that he was in the wrong corridor. I found out later, much later, after enough trust had been built that he was willing to discuss it, what Nile had found in Marcus' mind. No fear, not suppressed fear, not managed fear, not fear converted to aggression. The absence was genuine. The Zen-free's ability to sense emotional intent was precise enough to distinguish between species that did not experience fear and species that experienced fear but had learned to root it elsewhere, and what he found in Marcus was neither. What he found was something that his sensory equipment had never encountered in a living target before, a mind that had fully processed the situation, found it interesting, and moved on to calculating responses. Not brave, not fearless in the way that requires the suppression of something. Simply elsewhere, already past fear and into tactics. The same way a master chess player is not anxious about their opponent's move but curious about the response it opens. What Nile told me, much later, in a quiet conversation he clearly found difficult. It was like reading a star. Not cold, not absent, just operating at a temperature I did not have a name for. Marcus took one step forward. A single step, casual, unhurried, the weight shift of someone moving to examine something slightly closer. Nothing in the movement was aggressive. Nothing in the movement was threatening in any codified, cross-species legible way. 6 apex predators flinched. Torv, who had shrugged off plasma rounds in stress testing, who had shoulders wider than most species were tall, who had sent 3 cadets to the medical bay with handshakes, actually flinched. A full-body recoil of his massive frame, the ridge structures pressing so flat against his skull that they nearly disappeared. His hands came up by 6 inches in a gesture that was not quite defensive but was certainly not offensive. Senna's claws retracted completely. Her bioluminescent patterns had gone flat. No camouflage, no threat display, no distraction patterns. Her biology had decided that the best strategy was to be, as much as possible, not present. "We were just leaving," Nile said. His voice was tight in a way I had never heard from him. He was a being who had made careers out of maintaining absolute emotional control in situations of maximum stress, who had used his precise read on his own physiological state as a weapon alongside everything else. His voice was tight with fear, genuine, unmanaged, bypassing all the system's fear. And they left. 6 apex predators. The finest predatory students the Galactic Combat Academy had enrolled in recent memory. Creatures representing millions of years of evolutionary pressure toward efficient killing, toward dominance, toward a complete and total neutralization of any threat that stood between them and their objectives. They turned around and walked away from a single unarmed human who had done nothing, except stand in place, shift his weight forward 1 step, and smile. Marcus watched them go. His expression did not change until they had rounded the corner and their footsteps had faded. Then, and only then, did the smile disappear, not gradually, but all at once, like a light switching off. What replaced it was simply neutral, thoughtful, perhaps, the face of someone completing a calculation. He adjusted the strap of his training bag on his shoulder, turned to continue down the corridor, saw me. We looked at each other for what felt like a long time. In reality, it was probably 3 seconds. His expression showed no guilt, no surprise, no concern about having been observed by an instructor in a situation that was technically a violation of 6 academy behavioral codes. He simply registered my presence, processed the information, and filed it. He nodded once. Then he walked away. I stood in that corridor for 3 full minutes, trying to understand what I had just watched, trying to find a framework for it. In 17 cycles of teaching combat, I had seen bluffing, the manufactured display of confidence designed to conceal fear or disadvantage. I had seen genuine fearlessness, the damage-resistant psychology of species that had evolved in environments where fear responses were selected against because they were more dangerous than the threats themselves. I had seen calculated aggression, deliberate provocation, manipulated de-escalation. I had never seen anything like this, because what Marcus had done was not a bluff. A bluff requires that the reality differs from the display. You appear more dangerous than you are, and the deception is the weapon. But Marcus had not appeared more dangerous than he was. He had simply been accurately dangerous, in a frequency that the 6 most highly trained predators in my current class were not equipped to read, and the gap between what they expected and what they found had done the rest. I was still standing there, trying to reconstruct my understanding of what predator actually meant, when I finally decided to go find a human and ask him to explain himself. He was on the observation deck, watching Torx Prime's twin sun set over the training grounds. The light at that hour was extraordinary, deep copper and violet, the kind of colors that make even a punishing military installation look briefly like something worth looking at. Marcus was sitting on the railing, which was a safety violation, but one I decided to ignore given that I needed him in a cooperative mood. He was not surprised when I sat down beside him. He heard me coming. I realized. He had good ears, not exceptional, but adequate, and apparently always paying attention. That was an interesting display, I said, keeping my tone the careful neutral of an instructor who has not yet decided how to classify what they observed. He glanced at me. They were not really going to do anything. How could you possibly know that? The question seemed to genuinely interest him. He considered it for a moment, watching the suns begin their descent behind the horizon, because of where they chose to do it. A corridor that narrow limits mobility and negates their numbers advantage. If they were serious, they would have chosen open ground, somewhere tall could generate momentum, somewhere the twins had room to flank. They picked that corridor because it felt threatening, not because it was strategically sound. They were posturing. A pause, so I postured back. I was quiet for a moment, processing this. Your species has no natural weapons, no claws, no venom, no armor, yet you face 6 apex predators without hesitation. Explain that to me. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a quality I had not heard from him before. Not performance, not explanation for an audience, just someone working through something they thought about often. You know what is genuinely strange about Earth, he began. By any reasonable metric, we should not exist. Not anymore. Humans should have gone extinct approximately 2 million years ago. Maybe earlier. I do not understand. Earth is a nightmare. He said it simply, without drama, the way you describe something that simply is what it is. It is a genuinely terrible place to be a soft, slow, unarmed primate. We have bears that weigh 1,500 pounds and run 30 miles per hour. We have big cats that can drag prey twice their body weight up into trees. We have crocodilians that have remained essentially unchanged for 200 million years. 200 million. Instructor, because they were already so efficient at killing that evolution had nothing left to improve. We have sharks. We have wolves. We have hippopotamuses that kill more humans per year than almost any other large animal, despite being herbivores, because they are territorial and enormous and fast and they do not care about your intentions. He shook his head, something almost fond in his expression. We have venomous snakes, venomous spiders, venomous fish, venomous plants. We have insects that carry diseases that have killed hundreds of millions of us. Everything in our world either wants to eat us, poison us, step on us, or simply exists in proximity to us in ways that are lethal. It is an extraordinarily hostile environment for a species with no natural armor, no natural venom, and no natural weapons. Then how? I said, did you survive? He smiled. Not the corridor smile. This one reached his eyes. We cheated. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching the copper light deepen toward violet. We could not outrun the predators, so we outlasted them. Humans are persistence hunters. Instructor, we do not sprint. We were never fast enough to sprint effectively. What we do is walk. We maintain a steady pace for hours, odd days if necessary, and we follow prey until it collapses from exhaustion. We are one of the only species on our world capable of thermoregulating through sustained physical exertion. We sweat, which means we can run in heat that forces other animals to stop or die of hypothermia. There are documented records of human hunters tracking prey for 26 consecutive hours. Just walking, tracking, waiting, always coming. He paused. Imagine being the prey in that situation. You are faster. You are more powerful. You escape with ease, and you watch the strange, hairless ape fall behind, and you think the danger has passed. And then you look back and it is still there, still coming. You rest and it comes. You eat and it comes. You try to lose it in rough terrain, and an hour later it reappears on the ridge, still tracking, still moving at that same unhurried pace, still coming, until you cannot run anymore, until your body has nothing left. And then it is there. The word inevitable sat in the air between us. We hunted mammoths to extinction, he continued, and his tone was now something quiet and a little dark. Massive creatures, 12 feet at the shoulder, 6 tons of body, tusks designed to go anything that approached them. We killed them with sharpened sticks and patience. Saber-toothed cats, gone. Giant ground sloths, gone. Dire wolves, gone. The apex pack hunters of our world, animals with bone-crushing jaws and cooperative hunting strategies, and we outlasted them. We did not outfight them. We outlasted them, using tools, working in groups, and operating on the fundamental principle that we would not stop until either they were dead or we were. I thought about this, and the corridor is the same principle applied to psychology. He turned to look at me. And now there was something in his expression that was almost clinical, the detachment of someone explaining a solution to an engineering problem. Humans developed psychological warfare before we developed agriculture. Long before, we learned, probably within the first few 100,000 years of our existence, that sometimes you do not need to win a fight. You just need to convince the other predator that fighting you is not worth the cost. Pack hunters, every pack hunter, regardless of species, operates on cost-benefit analysis. The hunt has to be worth the risk. If the prey is likely to injure multiple pack members before it goes down, the calculus shifts. Better to find easier targets. And the smile, he agreed. On Earth, the smile is the most ambiguous expression our species has. We use it to express joy, to greet friends, to make others comfortable, to indicate non-aggression. But the same expression, in the right context, communicates something entirely different. It says, I am not afraid of you. It says, I have already processed the situation and found it manageable. It says, I know what you are and I have decided what to do about you. For most species, a threat display is a threat display. There is nothing ambiguous about it. But humans weaponize ambiguity. We use the same face for peace and for war, and that ambiguity, combined with the absence of fear responses that every predator instinctively expects, that is genuinely disorienting. It breaks the pattern recognition that pack hunters depend on. I was quiet for a long time after that. The twin suns had fully set. The training ground below was settling into the artificial twilight of the facility's night cycle, the sounds of the academy's evening routines drifting up, distant sparring, the percussion of training exercises, the Academy's constant low-frequency hum of ventilation and energy systems. Your species should not work, I said finally. By every metric we use to assess combat viability, you are fragile, slow, and under-equipped. You should not be at the top of your world's predator hierarchy. You should not be in this academy. Individually, sure, Marcus said, with the easy acceptance of someone who had made peace with a fact long ago. But we do not fight individually, and we do not compete individually. We fight smart. We use tools. We plan across timescales that most species do not sustain. We adapt. And most importantly, he looked at me with those unsettling forward-facing persistence hunter eyes. We do not quit. Not ever. Earth taught us that the correct response to an obstacle is not to assess whether you can overcome it in your current form, but to figure out how to overcome it regardless of your current form. With enough time and enough creativity and enough refusal to accept failure as permanent, we can overcome almost anything. The observation deck door hissed open behind us. 3 cadets walked in, saw Marcus in profile, and immediately turned around and left. He tracked them in his peripheral vision without turning his head, and something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "They are going to avoid you now," I said. "For a while," he agreed, "until they realize I am not actually that dangerous in a straight fight against species like them. Then they will recalibrate and test me differently, find the real edges." He shrugged. "That is fine. Keeps things honest. You think any of this is interesting?" He looked at me. "Instructor Mora. I voluntarily enrolled in a facility designed to systematically break the galaxy's finest predators. Of course I find this interesting. 3 months have passed since that corridor. I have been taking notes, because I believe what I have observed deserves documentation that might outlast this particular assignment. Marcus Webb did not become popular at the Galactic Combat Academy. He never tried to. Popularity requires a certain willingness to perform for an audience, and Marcus operated with a particular economy of someone who had decided long ago that energy spent on appearances was energy not spent on results. What he became instead was something rarer and, in the hierarchy of predator species, more significant. He became respected. Torv approached him first, approximately 2 weeks after the corridor. I watched from across the training bay as a massive Drazion crossed the space between them with the specific directness of someone who has decided a thing and is not going to spend time on preamble. He asked Marcus to demonstrate the joint lock technique he had used during a sparring session the previous week, a leverage-based technique that compensated for size disadvantage through precise anatomical knowledge of where pressure could be applied to create maximum effect with minimum force. No apology for the corridor, no acknowledgement of it. Just a request for information from someone who had been assessed as having useful information. Marcus showed him. He explained the biomechanics, where the joint structural weak points were, how body weight could substitute for raw muscle mass in the application, how to adjust the angle for species whose skeletal architecture differed from the human baseline. He was patient and precise and answered Tor's questions without condescension. Within 2 weeks, they were training together regularly. Within a month, Torv had incorporated 3 human-derived techniques into his combat style and improved his sparring ranking by 2 positions. Senna took longer, because the species did not release the memory of being outmaneuvered easily. But during a tactical exercise in the 4th week, Marcus called out an ambush configuration she had missed, a trap laid by an opposing team that would have resulted in her simulation failure if she had walked into it. He did not make a thing of it. He simply said, quietly, as they moved through the exercise, "Left corridor, 3 positions, waiting for you to commit to the right." She stopped, assessed, found them, adjusted. She started sitting near him at meal periods the next day. Not with him, near him. The careful proximity of a predator species, testing the edges of an unfamiliar dynamic. The Yulthari twins began consulting him on pack coordination theory, specifically on how to maintain synchronized function when operating in environments their partnership model had not evolved for chaotic, multivariable situations where their instinctive synchronization could become a liability if both of them made the same incorrect read simultaneously. Marcus thought about this for 3 days and then came back with a framework that borrowed from human special operations team theory, how to maintain coordination while building an individual assessment redundancy. They have been using it since. Their performance metrics improved measurably within 2 weeks. Vex invited him to a cultural exchange event. Marcus went. I have no idea what they talk about, but Vex replaced his filter permanently after that, which I had not expected. He had been resistant to wearing it for 2 cycles. Even Nile, who, based on what I have since learned about what he sensed in that corridor, experienced something close to a genuine psychological crisis in the aftermath, began acknowledging Marcus in corridors. Brief nods, the currency of predator species acknowledging someone who has earned a position in the hierarchy. Then, gradually, something more. They had a conversation in the library section that lasted 4 hours. Nile will not tell me what they discussed. But whatever it was, the tightness around his eyes when Marcus' name is mentioned has changed from something like remembered fear into something more like careful fascination. The transformation in the cohort's dynamic was not submission. Marcus had not dominated them through force, and he had not manipulated them through the careful cultivation of false impressions. What he had done was demonstrate, consistently and without performance, that his approach to the problems the Academy presented was effective, that his thinking was useful, That his different framework for understanding combat and survival was not an absence of the correct framework, but an alternative one with its own genuine strengths. He had earned recognition. In a cohort of 4 to 7 species, each with their own evolutionary history and their own framework for establishing hierarchy, he had found the thing they all shared: respect for demonstrated competence. I watched him run a mixed-species tactical team exercise last week. War games, full simulation, maximum complexity settings. Torv anchored the center, absorbing pressure and creating space. Senna ran reconnaissance so precisely that the opposing team did not know she had been in their territory until the debrief. The Yulthari twins executed flanking maneuvers that their synchronized awareness made virtually impossible to anticipate or counter. And Marcus coordinated everything from the center, moving information and people and timing with the particular efficiency of a species that had spent 2 million years figuring out how to make the available assets, whatever they happened to be, more than the sum of their parts. They won the exercise in 17 minutes. The previous record was 43. I want to tell you what I have finally come to understand about humans, because I think it matters, and I think the Galactic Council's Military Planning Division has not fully grasped it yet. The conventional analysis of human combat viability focuses on what they lack: no claws, no fangs, no natural armor, no venom, no size advantage, no significant speed advantage, no biological chemical defense. By every metric we typically use to assess a species' military potential, humans score poorly. They are fragile. They are slow. They are biologically unimpressive. This analysis is not wrong. It is simply incomplete in a way that, in practice, amounts to being catastrophically wrong. Humans do not have claws because they invented blades, and then projectile weapons, and then energy weapons that can sterilize continents. They do not have natural armor because they build armor, and then vehicles, and then fortifications, and then orbital systems. They do not have venom because they have something more flexible: chemistry. The same knowledge base that lets them neutralize natural toxins also lets them synthesize new ones, and they have spent considerable historical energy doing both simultaneously. Every biological advantage that the rest of us evolved over millions of years, humans engineered a solution for in a fraction of the time. And they keep engineering new solutions as new problems appear, which is a capability that biological evolution fundamentally does not have: the ability to consciously redesign itself in response to specific observed failures. But more than any of that, more than the tools, more than the technology, more than the accumulated engineering solutions to the problem of biological inadequacy, what makes humans genuinely, profoundly, keep me awake on the third shift dangerous is something I did not have a word for until I watched Marcus Webb stand in the corridor and break 6 apex predators with a smile and a step forward. Flexibility. Every other species I have taught evolved for something. Krata's species evolved for acid swamps. Senna's species evolved for lightless, dense jungle. The Yulthari evolved for coordinated pack hunting in frozen terrain. They are extraordinary at the things their evolutionary history selected for, and they are capable of adaptation within certain ranges of that baseline. But outside those ranges, adaptation becomes harder. The biological tools that make them exceptional in their native environment are sometimes liabilities in environments those tools were not designed for. Humans evolve for everything. Or more precisely, they evolve without any single environmental specialization becoming so dominant that it forecloses other possibilities. They can live in frozen wastelands and in burning deserts and at altitude and below sea level and in environments that require complete artificial life support systems that they built themselves. They can eat almost any organic material their biochemistry can extract energy from, which is a broader range than almost any other known omnivore. They can survive injuries that would kill most species, not because their bodies are more resilient, but because they have spent thousands of years developing and refining the medical knowledge to repair the damage. They can learn, not just absorb information, genuinely learn, update their models, discard approaches that are not working, and build new frameworks from observed evidence. Every individual human carries the accumulated knowledge of their entire species history as a starting point, and then adds to it. They are not the strongest. They are not the fastest. They are not the most naturally lethal. But they might be the most adaptable, and in a universe where survival requires navigating environments and challenges that no evolutionary history could have specifically prepared you for, adaptability might be the closest thing to an ultimate trait. The Galactic Council sent humans to this academy because they believed humans needed to learn how to be warriors. I have come to understand that what actually needed to happen was something different. The rest of us needed to learn what human warriors look like, while we still had the option of doing that learning among friends. Marcus will graduate at the top of his class. I have no uncertainty about this. Not because he is the strongest, or the fastest, or the most naturally gifted cadet I have ever instructed. He is not any of those things, but because he understands something that the others are still, some of them, in the process of grasping. Combat is not about looking dangerous. It is about being effective, consistently, reliably, adaptively effective regardless of what the situation turns out to be. Most species advertise bright colors, aggressive displays, obvious weapons, loud declarations of capability and intent. They want you to know what they are, because if you know what they are, you will make the calculation that engaging them is not worth the cost. Deterrence through visibility. It works. It has worked for millions of years across thousands of worlds. Humans do the opposite. They look harmless, deliberately, systematically, as a refined and ancient strategy until the precise moment that they need to not be. And by then, the opposing party has made all their decisions based on an incomplete assessment, and the gap between what they expected and what they are now facing is very, very difficult to recover from. I think about that smile sometimes, in quiet moments, in the third shift when the academy's rhythms slow and there is space for the kind of thinking that does not fit into training schedules. I find myself returning to it. That simple expression, those flat teeth, no venom, no fangs, just a deliberate exposure of the least biologically threatening dental configuration in the known galaxy, deployed as a weapon so effective that it ended a potential 6-on-1 ambush without a single blow. It was not magic. It was not some mystical human ability or evolutionary superpower. It was communication. Clear, precise, cross-species legible communication, delivered in a language that bypassed rational processing and spoke directly to the ancient survival instincts that every predator species shares regardless of their biochemistry or their world of origin. I am not prey, and if you treat me like prey, you will find out what I am instead. There are 547 recognized predator species in the Galactic Council's records. We have claws and fangs and venom and armor and size and strength. We have bioluminescence and neural disruption and chemical warfare and crystalline cutting edges and bone protrusions and exoskeletons built to withstand plasma. We have evolved across millions of years on worlds of extraordinary pressure into extraordinary things. And then there are humans, who looked at a universe full of exactly these things, shrugged in a way that somehow communicated both complete awareness of the danger and complete indifference to it, and proceeded to outlast everything their nightmare world threw at them through the particular combination of stubbornness, creativity, and refusal to accept permanent failure that they have, apparently, been practicing since before they had words or any of those concepts. I am, with a depth of feeling I did not expect, glad they are our allies, because I have spent 17 cycles teaching the galaxy's finest killers how to kill better, and for the first time in all of those cycles, I have genuinely no idea how I would teach someone to fight a human. You cannot outlast something that invented outlasting. You cannot outthink something that decided 2 million years ago in the middle of a nightmare world that thinking was the only tool it needed. You cannot break something that learned, before it learned language, that being too stubborn to break was the only survival strategy available. And you certainly cannot frighten something that looked at 6 of us in a narrow corridor on a military moon light years from its home planet and smiled. End of formal record. Instructor Ven Mora, Galactic Combat Academy, Torx Prime. Filed for distribution to Galactic Council Military Assessment Division. Classification recommendation. Required reading. Personal addendum. Not for formal record. He brought me something last week. A small object. A smooth dark stone, apparently carried from Earth, which I understand some humans do as a grounding habit, a physical reminder of origin and continuity. He set it on my desk without comment. I asked him what it was for. "It's just a rock," he said. "Then why give it to me?" He considered this for a moment. "Because you paid attention," he said. "Most people don't." He left before I could respond. I have had it on my desk since. It is an unremarkable stone by any objective standard. Gray, smooth, about the size of 2 cravatty fingers placed together. I find I am not able to set it aside. I am still not entirely sure what it means. But I am starting to think that uncertainty, that particular openness to things that do not fit existing frameworks, might be something the rest of us could afford to learn. From a species that looked at the universe and saw not limitations, but problems worth solving. I have spent 17 cycles teaching killers how to kill better. I have watched species that evolved in acid swamps and frozen wastelands and lightless deep ocean trenches learn to sharpen instincts that were already razor-edged by millions of years of brutal natural selection. I have overseen duels that ended in hospitalization, survival exercises that ended in tragedy, and sparring sessions that left permanent scars on bodies built to withstand punishment most species cannot imagine. I have seen violence in every flavor the galaxy offers. Swift violence, patient violence, beautiful violence, ugly violence, and I believe, with a quiet certainty of a veteran who has long since stopped being surprised, that there was nothing left capable of genuinely unsettling me. Then Marcus Webb walked into my training hall, and I learned that certainty is just ignorance wearing a confident expression. My name is Ven Mora. I am a combat instructor of 17 cycles, a third-generation Kravati warrior, and, as I would come to understand only gradually, the way you understand something that humbles you, apparently someone who had spent nearly 2 decades teaching combat without fully grasping what combat actually was. The Academy sits on Torx Prime, a moon chosen with deliberate cruelty by the Galactic Council's Military Planning Division. Its gravity runs roughly 1.4 standard, enough to make every movement feel like wading through invisible resistance, enough to make your bones ache after a long day and your muscles burn with the quiet protest of constant, grinding effort. The atmosphere is breathable but thin, keeping oxygen saturation just low enough that cardiovascular systems are always working slightly harder than comfortable. The terrain is hostile by design. Rock formations that crumble unpredictably, temperature swings between training cycles that demand physiological adaptability, local fauna that the administration euphemistically describes as character-building encounters. We do not coddle cadets here. We do not hold their appendages and whisper encouragements about potential and growth. The Galactic Academy exists for a single, unsentimental purpose: to take species who have already reached the apex of their respective food chains and make them survivable in actual warfare, the chaotic, resource-scarce, multi-species nightmare of real conflict, where your opponents have evolved under entirely different pressures and your biological advantages may be their biological expectations. The mortality rate hovers around 12%. Administration considers this acceptable. I consider it generous, given what we ask these cadets to endure. Our current advanced class reads like someone compiled a nature documentary from the galaxy's most extreme environments and then let the subjects enroll. 4 to 7 cadets, every single one of them a product of an evolutionary history that selected ruthlessly for combat effectiveness. Every one of them had killed before arriving here. Most of them had killed many times. A handful of them had killed things that, by any reasonable metric, should not have been killable by their species, and had survived anyway through some combination of ferocity, intelligence, and a particular kind of luck that only finds those willing to be unreasonably reckless. Let me introduce you to some of them, because context matters for what comes later. Craft of Erexian species evolved in acid swamps where the water itself would dissolve exposed flesh within seconds of contact. Hesitation in his ancestral environment did not mean failure. It meant dissolution. Literally, his exoskeleton, the adaptive result of millions of years of chemical pressure, could shrug off plasma rounds that would vaporize most armor plating. During a stress test in his first week, I watched him bite through a titanium alloy training bar. Not crack it, not bend it, bite through it. He looked vaguely disappointed by the experience, as though he had expected more resistance. Ma and Vika, the Thrust twins, came from a frozen world where pack coordination was not a learned behavior but a biological imperative. Their species developed synchronized hunting instincts before they developed language, the ability to read a packmate's intent and respond before communication was even possible. They had 6 eyes between them, 3 each, arranged for maximum field coverage, 4 arms each, arranged for maximum simultaneous threat engagement, and absolutely no philosophical framework that included the concept of a fair fight. They had trained together since before they could speak. Watching them spar against a single opponent was like watching one creature with 8 limbs and 2 brains work a problem from multiple angles simultaneously. Zara came from a high-gravity world where the evolutionary pressure was so extreme that the phrase food chain barely applied. It was more of a food web, everything consuming everything else in a constant, churning cycle of predation. Her people, the Karathai, developed retractable claws that could extend 8 inches and curve slightly, designed to hook beneath armor and tear rather than simply pierce. Her fangs injected a paralytic venom that acted within seconds on most known biochemistries. She moved with a particular liquid grace of a creature whose ancestors had to be perfectly efficient at every step, because on her world, wasted energy cost lives. I had never seen her lose a sparring match. Not once, in 6 weeks of intensive daily training. Not even close. Ren was a Shakros, 9 feet of bone protrusions and barely contained violence. His species had evolved in a high-competition environment where even courtship was ritualized combat, mates chosen not by display but by demonstrated willingness to fight to unconsciousness. The bone protrusions growing from his shoulders and forearms were natural armor, yes, but also natural weapons, sharp-edged and structurally reinforced to absorb and deliver impact. He broke 3 training dummies in his first week. Not damaged them, broke them, catastrophic structural failure requiring complete replacement. On the third one, I noted he seemed almost apologetic about it, in the way someone is apologetic when they have underestimated how fragile something was. These were my cadets. These were the beings I had spent 6 weeks training, observing, and coming to understand as individual expressions of their species' evolutionary excellence. 4 to 7 of the galaxy's finest instruments of biological violence, gathered on a punishing moon to become better at the thing their entire species' history had been building toward. And then there was Marcus Webb till he arrived on a standard transport with 7 other new cadets. And I will be honest with you, my first thought, watching him step off the landing pad, was that someone in administration had made a data entry error.